Hello and welcome back for another VMK in the game development series. In this video, I'm going to show you how to rework the handle mouse function that we created so that we can get mouse input. I'm going to need to rework this to use Windows messages because in future VMKs we're going to be implementing a GUI. And the GUI is going to be responsible for getting mouse clicks on buttons, on checkboxes, on slider bars, things like that. And to be able to do all of this kind of work, we need to restructure the way that the mouse is being handled. So that's what we're going to do. This video is really in preparation work so that when we go into the next set of videos for the GUI, we're going to be ready to just jump right into developing the GUI itself. So to start off, let's take a look at the way that the mouse is handled right now. Inside of our game OpenGL class, we go and call update game inside of the frame. So every time we go and render a frame, we're going to be calling update game. And inside here, we go and handle the keyboard, handle the mouse, update the player, pre-render, render everything in the scene, and then do everything else. Well, what we're interested in looking at is this handle mouse function. In this video, we're actually going to go in and remove this function and replace it with the same functionality, but we're going to do it a completely different way. The responsibility of this function is to do a couple things. First of all, it's making sure that the mouse is always centered on the screen. And actually, if you take a look at the code, it's not really doing that effectively because there's a discrepancy in coordinate systems. And I'll talk about this in a second. But before I do that, I just want to go over this function to give you an overview as what's going on in here. So at the top here, what we're doing is we're getting the window width and the window height that we're working with. We're dividing it by 2 to get the center location of our window. Then what we're doing is we're going to say we want to get the current mouse position, so we call this function here get mouse position, and this is going to return to us a point structure which gives us the x and the y coordinate of our mouse. Using that x and y coordinate, we can then calculate the difference between its position and the center location. Center location was again calculated up here. We get the difference, we multiply it by a scaling factor, which we've defined right here as being 0.001, and this gives us how far the mouse has moved horizontally, and this value here gives us how far the mouse has moved vertically since the last frame. Using these values, we pass it into player action, which causes our camera to move in the scene, depending on how much you're moving the mouse. After we've updated the camera, we go and reset the cursor position to be back at the very center. So then the next time we call handle mouse, we repeat the whole process, and this delta x and delta y is always calculated for us correctly because it's always with respect to the very center of the screen. So this is what we're going to be reproducing, but before we go in and start changing the code, I want to show you what the problem is with this code right now. Inside PaintShop Pro here, imagine that we're currently running at a resolution of 1024 by 768. If that's the case, then 1024 is going to be how many pixels we have on the screen here wide, like so. And 768 is going to be how many pixels high our screen is, like so. Now when we're resetting the position of the mouse, we're always resetting it with respect to this coordinate frame, which means that 0, 0 is located up here. So this is 0, 0, and this bottom corner here is actually 1023 by 767. That's the coordinate here that's located at the bottom right-hand corner. What we're going to be doing now is we're going to be getting the position of the mouse with respect to our client window. So if our application here is like so, drawn inside of a window on our desktop, then our coordinate systems that we're going to be getting coordinates from are with respect to the client area. And the client area is this white area here, and its coordinates are located 0, 0 at the top left-hand corner, and the maximum size is located down here, whatever it may be, x and y. Now when we get the x and y coordinate of the mouse, it's always going to be with respect to the client area. which means if we get a coordinate something like, I don't know, 100 by 50, then maybe that's this coordinate right here. But now, when we call the function to set the current mouse position to be at 100 by 50, that's going to be setting the mouse with respect to our global frame, or our frame with respect to our desktop. So it would actually position our mouse 100 units horizontally and 50 units down. So that could be somewhere over here. So you can see there's a discrepancy between this coordinate system and this coordinate system here. So we need to be able to fix this, and this is actually easy to do because Windows supplies a function that lets you convert from this coordinate system to the desktop coordinate system up here. So that's not a problem. You just have to be aware of this kind of thing happening whenever we're getting the mouse coordinates. Mouse coordinates are always with respect to the current frame. Alright, so let's go into our code now and start making some modifications. First thing we want to do is replicate this sort of functionality. We want to be able to set the location of the center, and we also want to be able to get the mouse position, update the location of the camera, and also reset the mouse at the very end of doing all these actions. So the first place we're going to go to is inside Game OpenGL Create. Inside here, we specify how large our window is that we want to be creating, if we are creating a windowed application. If we're using a full screen application, we don't have to worry about any kind of conversion because this coordinate system, the client area, is going to equal the coordinate system that is on the desktop. Both of them will be equal. We only have this problem when we're using a windowed application. Alright, so back inside Create here, what we want to do is, let's scroll down here. Okay, right here, we want to create a couple new variables, and they're going to be responsible for keeping track of the screen width and the screen height. And you can see that previously we did something similar here using the screen width and screen height, but we didn't actually make these member variables. We just made these local variables to be used down below. Now we're going to actually need these variables, so we're going to be creating member variables inside of Game OpenGL. Let's go into GameOpenGL.h and actually define them first. So right here we already have the width and the height, and this is the size of our window, but we also want to be able to have member variables that keep track of the size of our screen. So that's where we have this iScreen width and iScreen height. Alright, so back here inside of our create, we're going to save the width and save the height of our screen. Using those two new variables, we can now go in and update these parameters here. And we also have to be a little more careful now, because when we go into full screen mode right here, we need to change the size of the screen width and screen height, because we're actually changing the resolution of our display to be whatever the width and the height is up here. So down here, after we set the window size, we want to also reset the screen width and the screen height to be what the new values now are. Up here we've changed the display, so when we call this, these values will now be different than they were before, if the resolution is different from what the application was running at before we went into full screen. And let's just take a look down here. I think everything else down here inside of the create is okay. Now that we've saved the size of the screen, we can follow through our code to see where the next important thing we need to change. So if we go back inside of main.cpp, down here we see we call create for the OpenGL game engine, and then down below we call start message loop. So inside here we're going to go in and call initialize. And inside of initialize, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to reset the mouse position to be at the very center of the screen. And let's see here. we're going to put it here. Okay, we're doing it here. Move cursor to middle of the screen, and we're taking the width and the height and dividing it by 2. Instead of doing this now, we're going to use the new values that we just saved earlier. So we're taking the screen width, dividing it by 2, and the screen height and dividing it by 2. And we're going to take that center location and actually save it inside of p-user settings. So we're going to do that by creating a new function called setMouseReference. And later on, whenever we go and call getMousePosition, we're going to be using this reference point, which is the very center of the screen. The second function call here, setCursorPosition, actually moves the cursor to be located at the very center of the screen. This first one just saves where the location is. The second call actually moves it to the center location. Let's go inside of p-user settings here and define some variables to keep track of the center location. So we're going to create 2 integers that is going to be the reference mouse position for the very center of the screen in screen coordinates. So this is the coordinate system using with respect to the desktop located up here. The set function is just going to go in and take the x and the y value that is passed in and save it inside of those member variables. Okay, so we're done with the initialize function. Now, just like before, anytime we call update game, we need to go in and position the coordinate of the mouse to the very center of the screen. So we're going to comment this out here and replace it with the following. We're just going to be calling setCursorPosition, and again, we're using the screen width, screen height divided by 2, and we're setting the location of the mouse to be at the very center. So we've now accomplished the ability to take the mouse and place it at the very center of the screen, and we know where the center is. The only thing that we've left out is the ability to detect motion. The ability to detect motion is now going to come from a message that Windows is going to be handling for us. So let's go into Message Handler, and the same way that we're handling key down and key up, there's a case that lets you detect when the mouse is moved or even when a mouse button is pressed. And this is how we do that. We check for Windows message mouse move. Anytime the mouse is moved, this message will get generated by Windows, and the X and Y coordinate of the mouse position is stored inside of lparam. By taking the low word of lparam, you get the X coordinate, and the high word of lparam will give you the Y coordinate. If we're using full screen mode, we need to convert our coordinate systems from the client to the screen. So we call client to screen, pass in the handle of our window, and then we pass in our reference to this point here. This will take the coordinate system from our client space and convert it into our screen space. Now we can do some work with this new coordinate that we just received. If we're in play mode, so this is basically when we're moving around inside of our game engine, we want to update the player's action, so we're basically updating the camera position, and the way we do that is we calculate the delta x and the delta y of our mouse. We need to implement these functions, and we're going to put them inside of the user settings. We're passing in the current x and the current y position of the mouse with respect to the screen space, and this function is going to be responsible for figuring out exactly how far horizontally and vertically the mouse has moved. Then everything else just follows through because we've already implemented this player action function that takes in the x coordinate and the y coordinate delta from the mouse. So we're just left with having to implement this function here. Let's go into user settings and implement the following. We have getMouse x delta and getMouse y delta. We take the x coordinate, subtract the reference, which was set here by our setMouseReference, and we multiply that by the mouse speed. This is the same thing that we did before. You'll remember back inside of our handle mouse function. We take the difference in x, multiply it by the scale factor, and then the difference in y multiply it by the scale factor as well. So we're wrapping up that functionality now inside of this function here. We still need to define this variable here, so let's go ahead and do that, and we'll put it here with all this other stuff. In the constructor, we need to define the speed of the mouse, so let's just go ahead and up in here, let's just specify our mouse speed is going to be 0.001, same value that we used before. We can also remove our handle mouse because we've pretty much implemented all of this functionality now using our new technique. Here it is, mouse handle. Okay, let's build this and see what happens. Conversion from int to a float. Right, these values here are integers, and we want to multiply by a float, but oh, I defined this to be an integer. My bad. Let's go into here and make sure that that's a float. And here we forgot to replace these. Okay, and there we go. So now we're handling the mouse using message handlers rather than using our dedicated function to get the mouse position. So you can see I can move around, look the same way that I've always been using before, but now the code is a lot cleaner, and it allows me to expand into the next video where we're going to be able to pull the mouse position and display it inside of our console window. Once we have that working, we can then start implementing things like a custom mouse cursor, which will be very handy for when we start implementing our own GUIs. So come back for the next video where we're going to get the position of the mouse and display it inside of our console window.